Welcome to Creepy, the best horror storyteller on YouTube.
Sarah was tired. She had been driving for hours, and she was eager to get home to her bed. She had been working hard all week, and she was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. The road she was on was deserted. It was late at night, and there was no other traffic in sight. Sarah turned up the radio to keep herself company. She was singing along to her favorite song when she heard a loud bang. Sarah slammed on the brakes. Her car lurched to a stop, and the engine died. She looked around, confused. What had happened? Sarah got out of her car and looked under the hood. She didn't know anything about cars, but she could tell that something was wrong. The engine was smoking, and there was a strange smell in the air. Sarah tried to call for help, but her cell phone had no signal. She was all alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. Sarah started to feel uneasy. She looked around again, but she couldn't see anything. It was pitch black outside, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Sarah got back in her car and locked the doors. She tried to start the engine again, but it wouldn't turn over. She was stranded. Sarah sat in her car and waited. She didn't know how long she waited, but it felt like hours. She was starting to get cold and hungry. She also had to start using the bathroom. Sarah began to feel scared. She was all alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. What if no one came to help her? What if she was stuck here all night? Sarah tried to calm herself down. She told herself that everything was going to be okay. Someone would come to help her eventually. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's fear grew. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise. It was a rustling sound coming from the woods next to the road. Sarah's heart started to race. She held her breath and listened intently. The rustling sound continued. Sarah could see something moving in the darkness. It was a shadow. It was getting closer. Sarah's fear was overwhelming. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't make a sound. She was frozen in terror. The shadow came closer and closer. Sarah could see that it was a man. He was tall and thin, and he was wearing a black coat. His face was hidden in the darkness. The man stopped in front of Sarah's car. He stared at her through the windshield. Sarah could feel his eyes on her. She felt like she was being hunted. The man raised his hand. Sarah flinched, expecting him to hit her. But he didn't hit her. He just pointed at her. Sarah didn't know what to do. She was frozen in fear. The man continued to point at her. Then, the man turned and walked away. He disappeared into the woods as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah sat in her car, shaking. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know who the man was or what he wanted. But she knew one thing for sure: she was in danger. Sarah tried to start her car again, but it still wouldn't turn over. She was trapped. She was all alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. And there was a stranger lurking in the woods. Sarah sat in her car, frozen with fear. She didn't know what to do. She was all alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. And there was a stranger lurking in the woods. Sarah tried to start her car again, but it still wouldn't turn over. She was trapped. Sarah listened intently, but she couldn't hear anything. The woods were silent. Sarah took a deep breath and tried to calm herself down. She told herself that everything was going to be okay. The man was gone. He wasn't going to come back. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's fear grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise. It was a twig snapping, coming from the woods behind her car. Sarah's heart started to race. She held her breath and listened intently. The noise came again. It was closer this time. Sarah turned around and looked out the back window. She saw a shadow moving in the darkness. It was the man. The man was coming towards her car. He was walking slowly, deliberately. Sarah could feel his eyes on her. She felt like she was being hunted. Sarah tried to lock the back doors of her car, but they were already locked. She was trapped. The man stopped behind Sarah's car. He stood there for a long time, just staring at her. Sarah could feel his eyes on her back. She was paralyzed with fear. Then, the man started to walk around the car. He was moving slowly, deliberately. Sarah could see his reflection in the rearview mirror. He was tall and thin, and he was wearing a black coat. His face was hidden in the darkness. The man stopped in front of the driver's side window. He looked at Sarah through the windshield. Sarah could feel his eyes on her. She felt like she was being judged. The man raised his hand. Sarah flinched, expecting him to hit her. But he didn't hit her. He just pointed at her. Sarah didn't know what to do. She was frozen with fear. The man continued to point at her. Then, the man turned and walked away. He disappeared into the woods as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah sat in her car, shaking. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know who the man was or what he wanted. But she knew one thing for sure: she was in danger. Sarah tried to start her car again, but it still wouldn't turn over. She was trapped. She was all alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. And there was a stranger lurking in the woods. Sarah began to cry. She didn't know what to do. She was scared and alone. She just wanted to go home. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise. It was a loud engine noise coming from the road ahead of her. Sarah looked up and saw a pair of headlights approaching. Sarah's heart started to race. She didn't know who it was, but she hoped it was someone who could help her. The car pulled up next to Sarah's car. The driver's side window rolled down and a man's face appeared. "Are you okay?" the man asked. Sarah nodded. She was too scared to speak. "My car broke down," Sarah said. "I can't get it to start." "I can help you with that," the man said. The man got out of his car and walked over to Sarah's car. He looked at the engine and shook his head. "I'm afraid you're going to need a tow truck," the man said. But the man didn't leave. He stayed with Sarah until the tow truck arrived. He made sure that she was safe and that she got home okay. Sarah was grateful to the man for helping her. She didn't know what would have happened to her if he hadn't come along. But even though Sarah was safe now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still in danger. She knew that the man from the woods was out there somewhere, and she knew that he would be back. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. The events of the night before kept replaying in her mind. She had been so scared. She had thought that she was going to die. But then the stranger had helped her. He had saved her. Sarah didn't know what to think. Was the stranger a good guy or a bad guy? She didn't know. But she did know one thing for sure: she would never forget him. Sarah got out of bed and went to the window. She looked out at the night sky. The moon was full, and the stars were shining brightly. Sarah took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She tried to forget about the stranger and the events of the night before. But she couldn't. Sarah opened her eyes and looked out the window again. She saw a shadow moving in the distance. It was the stranger. Sarah's heart started to race. She took a step back from the window. The stranger kept coming. He was getting closer and closer. Sarah turned and ran to the door. She unlocked it and opened it. She ran out of her house and into the night. Sarah ran as fast as she could. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away from the stranger. Sarah ran down the street and turned the corner. She ran past houses and yards. She ran until she couldn't run anymore. Sarah collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. She looked around, but the stranger was gone. Sarah didn't know what to do. She was scared and alone. She didn't know where to go. Sarah got up and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew that she couldn't stay in her house. She didn't know if the stranger would come back, but she didn't want to take any chances. Sarah walked for hours. She walked until she was exhausted. She didn't know where she was, but she didn't care. She just needed to find a place to rest. Sarah saw a light in the distance. She walked towards it and saw that it was a gas station. Sarah walked into the gas station and went to the bathroom. Sarah locked the door and collapsed on the floor. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But she couldn't. She was too scared. Sarah kept thinking about the stranger. She wondered who he was and what he wanted. She wondered if he would come back. Sarah didn't know what to do. She was scared and alone. She didn't know where to go. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked pale and tired. Her hair was a mess and her eyes were red. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for the stranger to come back. Sarah walked out of the bathroom and went to the counter. She bought a cup of coffee and a pack of cigarettes. Sarah sat down at a table and started to smoke. She thought about what she should do next. Sarah decided that she needed to go to the police. She needed to tell them about the stranger and what had happened. Sarah finished her coffee and cigarettes. She stood up and walked to the door. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door. She stepped outside and into the morning sun. Sarah walked to the nearest police station and went inside. She told the police officer at the front desk that she needed to report a crime. The police officer took Sarah to a room and asked her to tell him what had happened. Sarah told him about the stranger, the car breakdown, and the attack. The police officer listened intently. He asked Sarah a lot of questions. When Sarah was finished, the police officer thanked her for her time. He told her that he would investigate the matter and that he would be in touch if he had any more questions. Sarah left the police station and walked back to her house. She was tired and scared, but she felt a little bit better. She had done the right thing. She had reported the crime to the police. Sarah walked into her house and locked the door. She went to her bedroom and collapsed on the bed. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. Sarah didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the stranger would come back. But she knew one thing for sure: she would never forget him.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more similar horror stories.